The silverback came out of the jungle at 6 in the morning and sat at the edge of the clearing. He didn't feed. He didn't display. He sat with his knuckles on the ground and his eyes fixed on the eastern tree line, and didn't move. By 7, the birds had gone quiet. By 8, the rest of his family had retreated deeper into the forest. By 9, Dr. Nadia Ferreira and her team had stopped everything they were doing and were watching him through binoculars. In 12 years of studying this group, they had never seen a silverback abandon his family to sit alone in an open space and stare at the trees. By noon, they would understand what he had been looking at. And what they found on the other side of those trees would change the fate of 11,000 acres of protected rainforest. The research station had been at the southern end of the clearing for 9 years. The gorilla family group, 14 animals, from the dominant silverback down to a 7-month-old infant, had been habituated to human presence over years of careful, patient work. They moved through their range with the researchers at a respectful distance, documenting, recording, building the kind of data set that conservation management depended on. Dr. Nadia Ferreira had led the station for 7 years. She knew Solomon's behavioral repertoire the way she knew the layout of her own research tent, without having to look by feel, by the accumulated pattern of thousands of observed hours. Solomon was what she called the silverback in her notes. He had been the dominant male for all 7 years she had been here, estimated 14 to 16 years old. The steady center of gravity around which 14 other lives organized themselves. He had left the family group before dawn. She had found this out when she arrived at 5:45 and the group wasn't where she'd left them the previous evening. She followed the trail north and found the family, minus Solomon, clustered unusually close together in the undergrowth, the females with their young pressed in tight. Females did this when something was wrong. Solomon was 60 meters away, at the eastern clearing edge, sitting. She radioed her team. They arrived within 20 minutes and set up at the clearing's southern edge, as far from Solomon as the clearing's dimensions allowed. He sat facing east. Not agitated, no chest beating, no vocalization. Sitting in the knuckle-resting posture he used when alert but not threatened. The listening posture, she noted. Head slightly lowered, ear canals open upward. The forest had been silent since about 7. Not the ordinary silence of a lull in bird activity. The specific, complete silence that she had learned over years in the field to pay attention to. The kind that sometimes preceded a storm, or the passage of something large. Something is happening on the other side of that tree line, she said. At 9:47, Solomon stood up. Slowly, the way large old animals stand when they've been still for a long time. He walked forward, not back to his family, toward the eastern tree line. He stopped at the edge and looked into the undergrowth. Then he turned and looked directly at Nadia. She had been looked at by gorillas many times. This was different. It carried something she could only describe as directedness, not the casual awareness of being seen, but the specific quality of being addressed. He turned and walked into the jungle. She made a decision. Kamau, stay with the family group. Keep a visual if they move. She turned to her other 3 researchers. We follow him, not standard protocol. She issued the instruction anyway. Document everything, she said, and walked into the eastern jungle behind the silverback. The undergrowth on the eastern side of the clearing had no trail. They pushed through on a compass bearing, following the intermittent signs of Solomon's passage. Displaced vegetation, the soft compression of his footfalls in the wet soil. Solomon was moving at a deliberate pace, fast enough that they had to push to keep him in hearing range, slow enough that he was not evading them. The forest was silent the entire way. After 40 minutes, they heard something else. Faint at first, a low mechanical sound filtering through the trees, rhythmic, industrial. As they pushed east, it grew clearer, heavy engines. multiple engines, the labored sound of machinery working in difficult terrain. She stopped her team, noted their GPS position. They were 2.8 kilometers east of the clearing, close to what her mental map told her was the park boundary. She moved forward carefully, using the trees for cover. The vegetation was thinning. The light between the trunks was different, brighter, harsher. She reached the edge of the undisturbed forest and stopped. The buffer zone between the park boundary and the concession's approved limit was gone. Not reduced, gone. Beyond the last row of intact old-growth trees. Red soil and felled timber, the stumps still bleeding sap, some trunks still green. 2 bulldozers working at the far edge. A timber skidder moving logs toward an access track cut from the south. She checked her GPS twice. The machinery was 300 meters inside the park. For 15 minutes she documented everything she could see, GPS-tagged photographs of the clearing's edge, the machinery positions, the extent of the cut timber, the access track. She photographed stumps with their fresh cuts. She photographed the felled canopy trees whose crowns lay on red earth where forest floor had been that morning. To her left, in the living trees still standing at the boundary, she heard a sound. She turned. Solomon was there, standing in the shadows 30 meters away, watching her, watching the clearing, watching the machinery that was, at that moment, pushing the boundary of his home westward by the hour. She looked at him. He looked at the machines. She raised her radio and called the park director. The investigation that followed confirmed what her photographs showed. Satellite archive imaging pulled that afternoon revealed the encroachment had been progressing for 6 weeks, approximately 50 meters per week. The boundary markers in the buffer zone had been systematically removed. The injunction was filed by the end of the week. The equipment was impounded. Criminal and civil proceedings were initiated against the concession operator. 40 hectares had been cleared. 40 hectares that could not be restored in any meaningful human timeframe. But the remaining 11,000 could be protected more effectively than they had been. In the incident report, Nadia Ferreira wrote one paragraph about Solomon that the district supervisor, to her credit, left in rather than removed. The silverback male exhibited sustained boundary monitoring behavior on the morning in question, positioning himself at the eastern edge of the clearing in a posture and for a duration inconsistent with normal resting, feeding, or social behavior. His subsequent movement toward the eastern forest boundary directly led the research team to the encroachment site. Whether this constitutes intentional guidance is beyond the scope of this report. What is within scope is this: we followed him, and what we found requires the attention of every authority responsible for this forest. The report was filed. The legal process ran. The park's eastern boundary was given a strengthened protection zone extending 1 kilometer further out, a legal change that required the encroachment case as its precedent. In her personal field journal, which was not part of any official record, she wrote something different. Solomon knew. He has been living on this territory his entire life. He knows every sound it makes and what those sounds mean. He heard the machinery 3 kilometers away, and he went to the boundary of his range and sat where we could see him and waited until we paid attention. I think he had been trying to tell us for longer than this morning. I think we weren't still enough to hear. Solomon resumed his normal patterns within weeks. He led the group through its feeding circuits. He mediated the social tensions of 14 lives in close proximity. He aged, the gray around his muzzle deepening, his movement occasionally careful in the way that age makes movement careful. He did not return to the clearing alone. Nadia watched for it, would not have admitted this to a review committee, but she watched for it. The specific behavior, the specific posture, the sitting at the eastern edge in the silence. He did not do it again. She thought this made sense. What he had done that morning was a response to a specific situation. Once the situation was resolved, The behavior was no longer needed. She thought about the intelligence of that. Not a generalized alarm. A targeted behavior directed at the one group of humans in Solomon's world who had the means to do something about what was happening on the other side of the trees. The park's eastern boundary held. The forest was still there, partly because, on a particular morning, a silverback gorilla had sat at the edge of a clearing at 6 in the morning and refused to move until someone paid attention to what he was looking at. She went back to her tent and wrote it down, as precisely as she could. For the record,